In this video explanation of this question, I'm going to have to make reference to certain lessons that we covered in our full-length course, but I'll try to keep that to minimum and have this be viable as a standalone lesson, so that might actually necessitate a couple of detours to explain some basic concepts. But anyway, so here we have a question stem that's asking us to describe where the argument is vulnerable to criticism. So here, what we call this is a flawed method of reasoning question, or otherwise known as a descriptive weakening question. The argument has committed some kind of flaw. And our job is to describe that flaw. You'll notice how the answer choices here begin with verbs, right? The argument confuses, takes, generalizes, fails. That's just what these questions do, because we're being asked to accuse the argument of having done something that's bad that it shouldn't have done. That's why they're all verbs here. Okay, so let's read the argument. Some anthropologists argue. Okay, so this is a very, very typical way for LSAT stimuli to begin, which is by telling you what some other people think. The author of this stimulus, the person who's writing this stuff, this person is just simply reporting to you, hey, those people over there called anthropologists, here's what they think, right? So, okay, so what do these anthropologists think? Let's use it's like blue here to represent what they say. Argue that. Here's what they argue. Blah, 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 all this stuff, right? Okay. So let's get clear on what this stuff is. The human species could not have survived prehistoric times if we did not have the ability to cope with a diverse natural environment. So they're saying the fact that we survived was dependent upon our having ability to cope with these natural environments, right? Or in other words, if we didn't have those ability to cope, then we wouldn't have survived. So either we want to think about it as fine. I mean, those are, it's like saying if you go to law school, then you took the LSAT. Or the other way to think about that is if you didn't take the LSAT, you're not going to law school. Those two are equivalent statements, logically equivalent statements. Okay, so let's write this down. This is what some anthropologists claim. They're claiming that the fact that we survived was dependent upon our having the ability to cope with a diverse environment. That's the stipulation here, right? See, because if we didn't have the ability to cope, if you did not have the ability to cope, then we wouldn't have survived. So we call this a contrapositive. There's in our curriculum, there's a lesson that covers this. But anyway, so just take it on faith for now that these two statements do say exactly the same things. I'm going to get rid of the second statement. Just focus on use this one. No need to redundantly represent it. Okay, so let's keep reading. However, okay, so in grammar lessons, we learned that however is what separates context from our argument. And this is important because context is where other people make their argument, or either that or I don't know, we're given some background information on what the argument is going to talk about. But the important thing is to realize that context is not argument. Context is context. And here, our context is someone else's argument, other people's argument. Our argument starts right here. And however is a word that often denotes that. So what is our argument? There's considerable evidence that this thing here, now what they do is they introduce these scientific phrases to sort of trip you up. You encounter this and you just kind of pause for like a second because you don't know how to pronounce it. But don't worry, just call it A. It doesn't matter how you pronounce it. You're not like being asked to read this aloud. Anyway, so that Australopithecus, a prehistoric species related to early humans, also thrived in a diverse array of environments, but became extinct. Hence is our conclusion indicator, also in our grammar lessons. So for an argument, it's very important to figure out what the premises are, what the conclusion is. Here are the premises, and here's the conclusion, and the support goes this way. We're supposed to believe this conclusion. The conclusion says the anthropologist's claim is false. We're supposed to believe this conclusion on the basis of these premises. And how good an argument is just whether or not these premises actually support this conclusion. So this conclusion here's another grammar lesson, makes a referential phrase. The anthropologist's claim. What does the anthropologist claim? Oh, right, this stuff up here. This stuff. This thing. Our argument's conclusion is that this thing is false. Here, so let's draw our argument. Our argument's conclusion is that we're going to say not this thing. Actually, better yet, since it makes use of referential phrasing, I'll do the same. Instead of writing in this pinkish, purplish color, I'm writing in blue. So our conclusion is that it's not the case that survival necessitates the ability to cope. Okay, all right. So let's think about this. Before we take a look at the premises, let's say you wanted to make an argument to convince me that this is not true, that this statement, that these people who make these statements are just wrong, right? It's not the case that survival depends on ability to cope. It's not the case that, I don't know, eating dinner will make you full. Okay, so how will you convince someone that it's not the case that eating dinner will make you full? Well, you show me that there's someone here who ate dinner yet wasn't full. If you're able to show me this, then I'm convinced. Then yeah, then I would just nod my head and say you're right. It's not true that eating dinner guarantees that you're going to be full. It's not the case that being full is a necessary condition of having eaten dinner. So it's the same thing here. You show that something has survived without, right? You show me that something has survived without having the ability to cope. So that's what you're supposed to show me. So I'm gonna use red to represent that. What we're looking for in our premises, if this argument were a good argument, is you show me something that survived and it had no ability to cope. So if you're able to do this, then I'm like, well, yeah, then now I'm convinced. It's not true that survival necessitates, right, ability to cope. It's not true that ability to cope is a necessary condition for survival, because look at this thing here that did survive and didn't have the ability to cope. Right? Okay, so except of course that this argument's flawed. It didn't do this. It didn't do this. What did it do? Well, it gave us Australopithecus, which what? Which didn't survive. You see, Australopithecus didn't survive, but it did have the ability to cope. Well, that's weird. That doesn't show me anything. You see, what does this? Now let's play the game in reverse, right? See, the red is the premise that we needed, right? This red is the premise that we actually needed in order to truly support this conclusion, right? If this were the conclusion, this is the premise that supports this conclusion. So that's the red. Now given that this stuff, the purple stuff, is what we actually have as the premise, what conclusion does this support? Well, not this statement. See, what this supports is this statement. It's not the case that having the ability to cope implies that you are going to survive. Okay, so maybe this is confusing. Let's think about it this way. If you want to persuade me that, it's not the case that all oranges are fruits, you want to say that's not the case, what would you do? You would show me something that's an orange, and simultaneously, it's not a fruit. If you can come up with a thing that's an orange and not a fruit, which, I mean, in our world, you're not going to be able to, right? Because in our world, it just so happens that oranges are fruits, but whatever, this is in the abstract. Right? If you really wanted to convince me that it's not the case that all oranges are fruits, you'd have to come up with a premise of something that is an orange and not a fruit. If you can do that, then I'm persuaded. Yeah, you're right. It's not the case that all oranges are fruits. Right? Do you see? That's exactly what's happening here. You see, this is the premise that's given to us. If this is the premise that's given to us, what it's able to do is it's able to prove the conclusion that, this. Except, unfortunately, this is not, right? Unfortunately, this is just not what the anthropologist said. What did the anthropologist? The anthropologist said this. You see, the author of this argument got confused. The anthropologist said that if you survive, then you definitely have the ability to cope. But the anthropologist never said that if you have the ability to cope, that's enough for you to survive. All sorts of other things is probably necessary for you to survive, like air, water. All these other things are necessary for you to survive. Right? That's why the anthropologist says something that's sort of, rather uncontroversial. Just, if you survive, then you have the ability to cope. Okay, and then the author confused this statement with this statement. The author thought that having ability to cope is right. So this is one of the most common mistakes that that is introduced to you in logical reasoning. This mistake of sufficiency for necessity. On question 22, just 2 questions ago in the same section, they're testing you. Plenty of the wrong answer choices were testing your understanding of precisely this mistake. Right. So it just goes to show that the LSAT only ever tests you on a handful of fundamental concepts. Conditional logic being one of them. Sufficiency, necessity being one of them. Okay, so let's get rid of the premise that we should have had, and let's focus out on that this is a premise that we do have, and this is the conclusion that it should have supported, except this is the conclusion that it's attempting to support and it's wrong. Right? This conclusion, it doesn't support this conclusion. It supports this conclusion, but that's not the conclusion made. Right? Because that's not what the anthropologist said. Okay, so let's read the answer choices here. A says that the argument confuses a condition. Okay, what condition? Being required. It confuses a condition being required for a given result to occur. So the condition here being required is the coping is required for a result to occur, survival. That's what the anthropologists are claiming, that coping is required for survival to occur. the argument has confused this necessary condition, this required condition, right? In one case, which is the anthropology case, the human beings case, Homo sapiens, our case, with the condition, the same condition, the very same condition, right? The coping being sufficient for such a result, the very same result, right? The very same result, surviving. Do you see? Sufficient. It's confused it. Now, all of a sudden, this necessary condition has become the sufficient condition. In a similar case, the Australopithecus case. So this is perfect. That's exactly what the mistake the argument has made. Now, you might be thinking this is the most convoluted way to say this ever, and you're right, it is very convoluted. But it's all because this language is very brand new to you. You do enough of these questions, this stuff is just going to read super simple to you. It's going to read like, I don't know, like Tom went for a walk in the park or something, right? So, for now, though, you just have to deal with it. For now, you just have to engage in this convoluted language and understand what this convoluted language is referring to. So drawing those lines on your paper really helps because that's where you get lost. It's very abstract. B says, it takes for granted that if one species had a characteristic that happened to enable it to survive certain conditions. Okay, so what does the argument presume? Like, the argument talks about Australopithecus as a species. So does it take for granted that this Australopithecus had something that enabled it to survive? But it doesn't, because the Australopithecus died. It became extinct. So you see, for what we say in our flaw method reasoning lessons, that you have to pass a two-step test. First, you have to be descriptively accurate. What you're accusing the argument of having done, the argument had better do it. See, here it fails the test. The argument doesn't even take for granted that if a species had the characteristics able to survive. What species are you talking about? Certainly not the Australopithecus, because it became extinct, right? So then at least one related species must have the same characteristics. I don't even know what. I mean, what the humans, or it's nonsense now. Okay, C says it generalizes from the fact that one species with a certain characteristic survives certain conditions, that all related species with the same must have survived exactly the same conditions. I mean, this is a flaw, sure, but it's just, again, but it's like B, right? It's like B in that it doesn't describe our argument. Our argument didn't do that. Okay, from the fact that one species with a certain character survived, what species? Like, our argument only talks about Australopithecus, which became extinct, right? So it doesn't do this. But if it did, if a different argument actually did this, it would be a flaw. You can't just generalize from one species having, say, hair and survived an ice age, that therefore all related species, let's say the species Homo sapiens, that all related species, all monkeys and whatever, with the same characteristics, with hair, must have all survived exactly the same conditions. That would be a different type of error. It's not the error we make here. D says, the argument fails to consider the possibility that Australopithecus had one or more characteristics that lessened its chances of surviving prehistoric times. Yeah, sure. I mean, okay, maybe Australopithecus had puny, brains, and it couldn't think its way out of a tough situation. That's fine, right? See, so D is starting to look very different from B and C, and because it is different. It passes that first test. It passes the descriptive test. It does actually describe our argument. Our argument has failed to do this, but so what? Arguments can fail to do a lot of things. I can come up with my own answer choice A, B, C, D, F. The argument failed to consider that most cats really like to drink milk, right? And it's true. The argument didn't say a damn thing about most cats liking to drink milk, but so what? It's not where the argument is vulnerable to criticism. So you see, step 2 of the test is not only do you have to be descriptively accurate, you also have to describe where the argument is weak, where the argument is vulnerable. So D, while being descriptively accurate, yeah, it failed to consider plenty of things about Australopithecus, but that's not where the argument is vulnerable to criticism. That's not the weak point, right? You might as well have said, D, failed to consider that dogs like to play fetch. E says, fails to consider the possibility that even if a condition caused the result to occur in one case, okay, but you see, I'm starting to think that this also is descriptively inaccurate, because what condition caused the result in one case, right? I mean, in our argument, the premise says Australopithecus had a condition of being able to cope, but it didn't survive. So they couldn't possibly mean that the ability to cope caused the Australopithecus not to survive. I mean, that seems just patently false. So E just also, whatever it's describing is not describing our argument.